Jocelyn Rojo Carranzas was an 11-year-old who committed suicide in Texas on February 8, 2025. Her mother claims she was bullied by other students in her school who claimed her family was in the U.S. illegally. She was 11 years old. I was 11 when Trump was elected in 2016 for the first time, and I also went through a lot of bullying. It's crazy to me that 8 years later, 11-year-olds are dealing with the same thing I did. I was in Jocelyn's shoes. I was called slurs. My friends were called slurs. I was told to go back to our country. I even remember vividly the night before the election when I was on the bus coming home. A much younger kid actually, and I quote, said, "Trump's gonna win and your ugly Mexican ass is gonna go back to your country where you belong," unquote. A mother of one of her schoolmates said that her daughter, who was white, would come home crying because she feared for her Hispanic friends because of the rumors being spread around her school. Mind you, Jocelyn was in 6th grade. To think that kids have this mindset is insane. And her case wasn't covered as much in the media as you would think. But not even 2 weeks later, on February 18th, the White House posted a video to X, formerly known as Twitter, titled ASMR Illegal Alien Deportation. ASMR refers to a pleasant tingling feeling people experience when watching videos featuring unusual sounds. Are we serious? The video is no talking, as ASMR videos are, but it's chains being moved, handcuffs being placed on individuals, and the plane noise in the back. How did the country end up here is my question. And I'm Diana Rendon Chavez, and I will be taking us through how we ended here. I'm going to start with immigration history focused in Oregon, the overcriminalization of immigration, the Latino threat narrative, ICE churches Guantanamo, and Trump's escalation. Hopefully by the end of this, we will be able to figure out how this country is going and how we can move on from that and know our rights as citizens. The first section, immigration history in the Oregon. I'm going to be talking about a couple articles, the first one being Open Arms or Arm's Length, a historical perspective on the immigration in Oregon. Now, I'm only going to be summarizing the parts that involve Latinos because that's what this podcast is about. But just to give a little brief history, I'm going to start with a quote. Native people had lived in the region for thousands of years, and their encounters with Europeans in the 18th century and first half of the 19th century profoundly influenced Oregonians' subsequent attitudes regarding race, ethnicity, and cultural differences, unquote. I want to start with this quote because it gives us a feel of the mindset of the Oregonians, especially from the European descent. So during this time, Native Americans died, lost land, and were killed. Oregonians were taking steps to preserve the European descent. In 1844, they barred blacks and Chinese people from voting and owning land. Moving on, Immigration Act of 1924, a quota system that sharply limited immigration from the regions of the world and favored immigrants from the northern and central Europe. So, where do Latinos fit into all this? In the article, we talk about how early in the century, Mexican migration accelerated with the growing integration of American and Mexican economies. The Act of 1924 was actually the first act to make entry into the U.S. illegally a crime. It is also talked about in the article that the Arcero program in the 1940s influenced migrational law. It actually brought thousands of Mexican workers into the U.S. Over 15,000 Mexicans were reported in Oregon between 1940 and 1945. This includes the ones that were already here and the ones that came with the Arcero program. This was the start of it all, and since then, it's been slowed down by a couple policies, much more in the 2000s. But back then, in the 1950s, there was an operation called Operation Wetback, which was an INS effort to temporarily deter migration. Now, moving on from that article, I want to talk about the article Latinas and Citizenship in Oregon by Marcela Mendoza. In the mid-20th century, Mexicano and Tejano families had established communities in the Willamette and the Rogue River valleys, and more recently along the Oregon coast. Now, that's the only thing I'm going to talk about in that article. But as of now, thanks to American Immigration Council, they found that as of 2023, over 9.5% of Oregon is made of immigrants. 400,000 residents are immigrants. Over 200,000 residents living here are living with at least one immigrant parent. 5.6 billion taxes paid by these immigrants, and 14.3 billion immigrant spending powers. This is just in Oregon. That just gives us a feel of the history of immigrants coming to Oregon. Overcriminalization of immigration. So, before we start, we have to keep in the back of our head that Oregon is a sanctuary state. Well, it proclaims to be. So every unfair thing I'm going to be talking about, especially in Oregon, is being done under it being claimed to be a sanctuary state. Overcriminalization of immigration. So, immigration violations were once considered civil infractions, but they are now considered crimes. Historically, crossing the border without papers was a misdemeanor at least. But in the 2000s, that changed. Okay, so ICE, which stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, was established in 2003. In December of 2006, in a newspaper, it was stated that any person arrested in Gaston, Oregon, who was thought to be foreign-born, meaning they looked it, would have their citizenship status checked. Now, this meant Gaston could not be a sanctuary county, as it could not help people that were immigrants if they were arrested. This program was to be finalized in February of the next year. 10 agents in the sheriff office in Gaston were being trained by ICE. 10. That is a crazy amount, a large amount for the size of the place. Another article by Jennifer M. Chacun titled Overcriminalizing Immigration. So it talks about the on and off between the state and the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court denying the state abilities to harm immigrants and to attack them more. But in her article, she states that recently a wave of state and local immigration policies have been sweeping across the nation. Thousands of local governments around the country have been debating or enacting these policies designed to restrict the ability of unauthorized migrants to live and work in their communities. This is a nationwide problem, but to focus on Oregon, we're going to talk about an article called The Impact of the U.S. State-Level Immigration Reform on Undocumented Mexican Migrants, the Loss of Access to Driver's Licenses in Oregon. This article is by Mary C. King and more. In 2008, the state of Oregon began requiring applicants with a driver's license to provide proof of legal residence in the United States. This already impacted 95% of immigrants that already held a license because they would now have to prove their citizenship, which they didn't have to. Their citizenship or their legal residency or work permit or etc. In 2009, interviewed over 400 Spanish speakers. A lot of them showed stress because of the inability to get to work, to go get education, to get medical care, to go to church, etc. This led to illegal driving. The United States, Oregon, they knew what they were doing. Because driving without having insurance on your car, without a license, is a major crime. So with this, if they were caught, the undocumented people could face deportation. But that is one case in Oregon, which leads us to our next section. The Latino threat narrative is section 3. So this term is coined by scholar Leo Chavez and is a term that describes a false and racist idea that Latino immigrants are a danger to the American society. This narrative portrays Latinos as criminals, job stealers, unassimilable, and a demographic threat. In Chavez's article, he talks about how a scholar in the 2004 issue of the Foreign Policy compares Latinos to European immigrants. and found that unlike past immigrant groups, Latinos have not assimilated into the mainstream U.S. culture. And throughout his whole article, he was just saying that they were a threat and they were rejecting the values that built the American dream. Overall, this narrative is used by politicians and media outlets to push anti-immigration policies. This is harmful because it justifies harsh immigration laws such as mass deportation and separating families, and fuels racist violence. The University of Chicago Journals made a study called Cognitive and Emotional Outcomes of Latino Threat Narratives in the News Media, a study. Now, in this study, the method was they conducted a random design to get the participants the perceptions of Latino immigrants and their emotional responses to threat narratives in the news media. There was 208 participants. They were randomly assigned. 68 were assigned to read a news story about Latino immigrants as economic threats, and the other, which were 70, read a news article about Latino immigrants as cultural threats. And in the control group of this study, which was 70 people, read an article that did not implicate Latinos as threats. The results of this was that participants who read the story about a Latino economic threat reported more intense negative emotions and significantly higher levels of perceived realistic threats from Latino immigrants than participants in the control group. Participants who read the article discussing a Latino cultural threat reported more intense positive emotions and significantly higher levels of perceived symbolic threats from Latino immigrants than the control group. They concluded that this finding suggests that different types of Latino threat narratives have distinct influences on individuals' emotions and threat perceptions of Latino immigrants. Media, mostly now, is treating immigrants, especially Latinos and Mexicans, as a threat. Talked about the Twitter video, X video posted by the White House that is considered to be part of the Latino threat. They're using a trend, an ASMR, which is seen by a lot of smaller children, to portray that what they're doing is a good thing and what they're doing is satisfying in a way, which leads us to our last part. We have arrived to our final section, ICE, churches, Guantanamo, and Trump's escalation. ICE, under Trump's second presidency, has made things much worse. ICE has expanded its powers dramatically through Trump's first term in office. His zero-tolerance policy led thousands of families to be separated, and he has started mass deportations and detention camps. ICE can now arrest immigrants in places that were once considered safe zones, like churches. For years, ICE stayed away from places of worship, schools, and hospitals, but under Trump, those protections have been ignored. Churches across the United States, including Oregon, have been shelters for immigrants facing deportation. I want to quickly talk about Jose Chicas, who is a pastor from North Carolina. He had lived in the United States for over 30 years, but because of an old misdemeanor charge from the 1980s, ICE was suddenly targeting him for deportation under Trump's stricter policies. Now, this was back in 2016 when Trump first became president. Instead of being separated from his family, he took refuge in church and lived there for 3 years, afraid that the moment he stepped outside, he'd be arrested. But now, ICE is monitoring people near places of worship and even making arrests outside of the doors. An article by CNN talks about a recent case of this. In the state of Georgia, Kenya Colundres, her husband, Wilson Rogelio Velazquez Cruz, was arrested by ICE officers during a church service on January 26, 2025. Her husband had received a call during service, which he did not answer, and momentarily after, his immigration GPS ankle monitor started going off. She told Cruz to go outside and check it, where ICE agents arrested him. What we get from this case is that ICE is now using ankle monitors placed on people who have been given asylum to deport them. He, as many other immigrants that have ankle monitors, have done no crime, but they're still being arrested. Trump's team has floated the idea of sending detained immigrants to Guantanamo Bay. Yes, that's the same prison used for suspected terrorists after 9/11. His logic is to remove immigrants from the U.S. entirely and place them in detention facilities. It's not just for the United States. Mexico has been forced to accept immigrants not from Mexico, including asylum seekers from Central America and even countries as far as Africa and Asia. Under Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, thousands of asylum seekers were sent to border cities with no resources, making them vulnerable to violence, human trafficking, and extreme poverty. The scary part is that these policies aren't just leftovers from the past. They're becoming even worse in Trump's second presidency. Today, we explored Oregon's immigration history, how the law over-criminalizes immigration, how the power of the Latino threat narrative is used, and how ICE is escalating under Trump's leadership. But this isn't just history, it's happening now. This is a reason why 11-year-olds like Jocelyn have been fearing for their lives. But you can do something about this. You can educate yourself on immigration policies. You can find local immigrant advocacy groups around you. And you should know your rights in Oregon. The government programs in Oregon cannot share your information with ICE. You must get equal treatment. Police in Oregon can't ask you about your immigration status. And ICE cannot arrest you at courthouses. We must educate ourselves and we must fight for our rights. Thank you and goodbye.